It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
Hello, everybody. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. It is the very end of July, beginning of August, and I just returned from, and I'm trying to recover from, Gateway to Reason. Had a fantastic time. Unfortunately, the crowd was a little smaller than we were hoping for, but the 200 of us that were there had a fantastic time, an incredible list of speakers, great entertainment. And, of course, the big question for a conference like that is if we can't get more than 200 people, we're going to have to scale it back. And maybe that's okay. It'd be a nice one-day conference with a dozen speakers and maybe one instead of 5 or 6 entertainers. But it was great. Had a fantastic time. Also got to put in part of a baseball game. I think they call it baseball. Yeah, the Cardinals. Sat about 3 innings in the sun and decided that was enough for me because I was going to burn, but had absolute wonderful fun time. And again, of course, that's partly why this show is coming out late. However, I think you're just going to love the interview we have today. Chris Chabris, who we'll talk to a little bit later on, is a research psychologist. I think that's the right term. We'll find out in the interview. But has done a lot of research and wrote a book about human perceptions, memory, and we even get to talk about how people use those memories or false memories in interpreting and looking at their performance in the stock market, which is fantastic. So I think that interview, it amazingly covers a lot of the topics of skepticism and how the mind works and investing all in one, and it's almost a full hour by itself. That the Investing Skeptically segment is going to be a little short. And then, of course, near the end, I'll have a little recap for you. But the Investing Skeptically today is Employee Stock Purchase Program. Not only did I get an email from a listener, but someone asked at Gateway to Reason, I don't think, Phil, you've ever covered this topic. And I think they're right. It's amazing to me. I keep wondering when I'm going to run out of things to talk about, but it looks like that may never happen. So Employee Stock Purchase Program, a lot of companies allow employees the chance to buy stock in the company they're currently working for. It is a nice way to feel like you're part of the team and you're involved, and your financial success is also dependent on the company's financial success. And so I think it's a nice idea, but I'm not here to tell you what's good for the company. I'm here to tell you what's good for you. So we're going to set some basic rules, which kind of are guidelines, I guess, that you might want to consider and follow depending on your situation. First of all, you should not have more than 5% of your money in any one specific stock. If you really love the company, if you really know the company and you really understand where they're going, and that can be very hard to do and to do comfortably. So I'm even hesitant to give this exception, but if you really want to go to 10% in one company, I can work with that, but I'm not comfortable with it. Beyond that's just crazy risky because it's specific stock risk. If that one company fails, you can lose a generous part of your portfolio, and it could be considered even worse if it is the company that you work for, because the stock may collapse at the same time you lose your job. So if you're close to or near retirement, you've got a bunch of money in your company and something goes wrong, it can be very rough, especially if you're in your late 50s or early 60s and you're not quite ready for retirement. It can be very challenging to find a replacement job at the same income because of age, because of the economy. Maybe the company went broke because we had a recession. And at the same time, you think, well, maybe I'll just go ahead and quit early, quit the whole working thing and just retire. Well, if you had 30% of your money in that company and it went bankrupt, you not only have possibly a decrease in your portfolio because of market performance, but that one stock wiped you out. So you could lose half or more of your portfolio at the very time you have a job, and it's a recession. So a really bad combination to have. So particularly if you're closer to retirement, don't have a lot of company in a stock that you've been working for a long time. So the question that is raised to me is, should I buy stock in my company at all? So the basic guidelines. If your employer has a program where you can buy the stock in your company and no additional mathematical or financial inducement is provided, my short answer is no. It is not part of my plan. I use index funds. I invest for the long term. I seek aggressively diversification. Buying a whole bunch of money in one specific stock is not something I generally recommend. And so in this case, I won't specifically recommend that you do it. Now, there's exceptions to this. One of them is if the employer gives you a generous discount on buying the stock. So let's say you make $100,000 a year and you're allowed to put in up to 20% of your pay in the employee stock purchase program, which would be $20,000. And they give you a 15% discount on the stock at the end of the year when it's time for you to buy it. So if your $20,000 essentially buys $23,000, yeah, that was easy to do, $23,000, you should do that. And then what you should do with those stocks is immediately turn around and sell it. And all the time people will say, well, then I'll have to pay taxes on it. Yes, you will. You'll have to pay taxes on it and all the gains that you made, including the 15% discount. But the extra $3,000 that you made, I consider to be free money. So pay the tax on the $20,000 that you earned, because you would have earned it even if you didn't put it in the stock purchase program, and then pay the tax on the extra $3,000, and you pocket the rest. I mean, even if the tax is 33%, if you earn $3,000 and pay tax on 33%, you made $2,000. What else can you do for virtually no effort to make $2,000 net after taxes? Let's not get too focused on the taxes. Do you end up with more money? And if the answer is yes, and in this case that's the situation, pocket the $2,000. What's the complication? It's one of these things that a lot of times when people buy a stock, and that's why companies do this, or if you inherit a stock, there's this momentum that you have to get over because now you own it. Now I've got to decide if I should keep it, if I should sell it. Well, I'm telling you, it's really easy. You just decide in advance. You're going to buy it, you're going to lock in the 15%, and you're going to freaking sell it. It's no-brainer. If you just set your mind to doing that, and you automate it, bam, boom, it's done. You can also look at it. People will tell me, but if I hold it more than a year, any gains that I made will be at capital gains, they'll be lower. That's true, but the discount was still earned or counts kind of as income. So you still got to pay your marginal tax rate. You only pay capital gains if it goes up. If it goes down, which is what we're trying to avoid, the risk of it going down. So don't think about it too hard. Just get it, flip it, sell it. So, that's the short term. Now, in some cases, and I had this at the Gateway to Reason conference, someone came up to me and they said they get a 15% discount on the lower price at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year. And I don't care if you have to borrow money to do this. Now, I want you to borrow it, hopefully as low as possible. If your credit is terrible and you have to pay 20% interest, okay, this is not going to work for you because that's an awful high interest rate. But if it's 15% on the lower price at the beginning or the end of the year, here's the example. You could have stock that's worth $20 at the beginning of the year. And so you buy it for $20 a share minus 15%. So that's going to be about, we're rounding here, about $17. And then it's $40 at the end of the year. If you put $20,000 in that program, you're going to make way more than $40,000 when you sell it. And yes, you're going to pay tax on it. Boo-hoo. But you just cleared 20 plus grand, and even after taxes, 15, 17 grand. So if you have something like that, you want to find a way to get as much money in there as humanly possible. If the stock goes down, and it was 20 at the beginning and it's 18 at the end, we only get 15% off the lower price at the end of the year. You flip it right away, and you only make a couple of grand. No big deal, but you had that opportunity. Where else can you go that you can buy a stock kind of without the risk of it going down? And if it goes down, you get the lower price. If it goes up, you get the lower price. It's kind of magic. So that's some thoughts about employee stock purchase programs. So think about that if you have one at your employer. Of course, if you have questions about that, or if I got something wrong, which is definitely possible because I started talking about taxes, you may email me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com, and we're going to take a little break, and then we're going to go into our interview.
But in the bullshit department, a businessman can't hold a candle to a clergyman. Because I got to tell you the truth, folks. I got to tell you the truth. When it comes to bullshit, big time, major league bullshit, you have to stand in awe of the all-time champion of false promises and exaggerated claims, religion. No contest. No contest. Religion easily has the greatest bullshit story ever told. Think about it. Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish, where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Of course, this is Phil Ferguson, and we're going to talk next to Christopher F. Chabris, and we're going to talk about his works. Christopher, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm fantastic. And what I want the listeners to do, if they don't know anything about your work, and we're going to go into your work at length here, before we get started, if you are at home or somewhere, I mean, if you're driving in the car, just keep listening to the show. But if you can pause this podcast and go to YouTube, just for a couple of minutes, what I want you to do is, of course, pause and then go to YouTube and look for a video, and you want to use the search criteria that says selective attention test. Now, some of my listeners may have seen this, but if you haven't, you want to see it before we talk about it. So YouTube selective attention test, it's got 17 million plus views, and it's by Simons and Chabris, and it's on Daniel Simon's YouTube channel. So go check that out, and I'm going to give you a second to go do that and then come back. All right, Chris, hopefully they're back by now, or if not, they're going to pause. Let's talk about that, can we?
Sure.
What the hell were you guys thinking when you put that together?
Well, oddly enough, the main thing we were thinking about was how to come up with a classroom exercise that the students could do in a Harvard psychology course that Dan Simons and I were teaching. Dan was a new professor, and I was a sort of an advanced graduate student, and we taught a course on experimental methods in cognitive psychology. And usually when you teach students how to do experiments, you have them each do their own experiment and then sort of, write it up as a research project and so on. But Dan had the extremely clever idea of not only doing that, but also having the students work together on a single experiment that everyone could participate in. And he knew about previous research on really attention, selective attention, by the famous cognitive psychologist Ulrich Neisser from way back in the 70s. This was late 90s when we did this at Harvard, but back in the 70s, Neisser had done some strange experiments on what he called selective looking, where Neisser had taken these videos of people moving around passing basketballs and used some technique with mirrors to superimpose a bunch of video streams on each other. And Dan said we could redo that ourselves, but do an improved version of it. Because for one thing, we have video editing software, and it's now the late '90s, so you don't need to build mirrors and everything like that to edit video, and we could make some other improvements on it. So it was really sort of partially out of necessity and inspiration that Dan suggested doing that experiment, and we sort of recreated. We started with a starting point of what Neisser did in his work. And we recreated that, and then we took a few additional steps, which I think really made the difference in why what we did wound up having the impact that it did, even though Neisser had started down the path 2 decades earlier.
Well, almost all work is, of course, built on the shoulders of giants, so it's not surprising that someone kind of dabbled with this idea, and you guys just happened to take it to a whole new level. And for the listeners that don't know yet or didn't go look at the video, it's your last chance. Go look at the video. But basically, I think if I recall correctly, there's 6 students. It might be 8, but see, I can't even remember myself, and I've watched it multiple times. And half of them are in white shirts, and half of them are probably in black shirts, and they pass basketballs. Is that right?
Correct.
And the viewer, the subject, is instructed to count the number of times people in, let's say, the white shirts pass the basketball, whether it's aerial or a bouncing pass, and it only goes 30, 40 seconds, something like that. And how many passes did they actually end up making?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but that's what we ask them after they're done watching the video. I don't remember the particular numbers. It almost doesn't matter, because the point is that they pay attention to the ball being thrown around and the people throwing the ball during this for one of the 2 groups, either the people in white shirts or the people in black shirts. And then something happens in the middle of all this action that a lot of people completely don't notice and don't mention at the end after we have asked them how many passes they count. We asked them, did you notice anything else unusual? And a lot of them have no recollection of it.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if it was probably something like 10 years ago. And of course, the video is from 18 years ago. But about 10 years ago, I happened to see this at a presentation, and I myself missed the thing that is unmissable. And I guess the data says that about half people miss it.
Yeah, so I guess it's maybe time to say what it is that people are missing. We could go on just talking about the thing. So What happens is in different versions of these videos, different things happen. But the one that everybody has sort of latched onto as being the funnest and the one that gets shown most often, a person in a gorilla suit walks through the middle of the action of these 6 people walking around passing basketballs and turns and faces the camera, beats its chest, and then walks off the other side of the screen and is on there for a total of 9 seconds out of a video that lasts about 65 seconds in all. And yet about half of the people don't notice that when they're paying attention to the people in white shirts. If they're paying attention to the people in black shirts, they're more likely to notice the gorilla because the gorilla is all black and shares sort of an elementary feature, a color, with what they are paying attention to. But even then, not everybody notices it.
Well, I was just wondering myself, if the black would, because I don't remember that in the book, if the black would change the attention, or I was just reading a study about naming of colors from different cultures throughout the world and how they use their language. And often people come up with light and dark is the first colors, and then it's often something like red, because the red is the most different, apparently, from all other colors. I wondered if someone came out in a red costume, how that would affect the results.
Well, we didn't try that, nor did we try a bunny costume or anything like that, because the reason the gorilla was chosen was that one of the students in Dan's lab who was helping with the experiment was also a graduate student in another lab in the psychology department where they happened to have a gorilla costume, which they used for studies with babies, in fact, and for a completely different purpose that had nothing to do with attention or anything like that. And so, there was a gorilla suit around, so we tried it. It's interesting you mentioned red, though. I'm not an expert on color perception myself, but in later research, my colleagues, Dan Simons and others, Brian Scholl and Steve Most and other researchers, created a computerized version of the same task where instead of people throwing basketballs and a gorilla, there are just shapes moving around on the screen. And you have to do something like count how many times they bump into the side of the screen and bump off. And in one of those experiments, they actually had a red cross move across the screen right in the middle. And all the other shapes were black and white, so the red was extremely distinctive. And yet it still was not noticed by about a third of the people who were doing this, even though one would predict that something that was different in color, different in shape, it was the only cross, it moved along a different pathway. All the other ones kind of moved around randomly. The red cross moved in a straight line across the middle of the screen, and so on. It sort of tried to maximize the chances that people would notice this thing, and still about a third of them didn't notice.
And of course, this is something that's well known by magicians, that if they can direct your attention, they can do almost anything, because you're not going to see it.
Yes, in a way, it's sort of and might be the fundamental principle of magic is that what happens when you're not paying attention, what happens that you don't see, can seem like magic when you only see the results of the action, right, instead of the action itself, and you don't know how it was achieved because you weren't paying attention. Then it kind of seems like magic. It's also, by the way, it's also not well understood by people who drive in cars and talk on cell phones. Because and the reason why I say that specifically about this Red Cross experiment was that Brian Scholl, one of our collaborators, who's now a professor at Yale, I believe he ran the same Red Cross experiment, but he actually had some of the subjects talk on the phone during the experiment, and then the number who didn't see the Red Cross went up from something like 30% to 90%, or some very high number. So whereas magicians might know how easy it is to control attention and how much people don't notice when they're paying attention to one thing, drivers who talk on their phones are sort of the opposite in what they realize.
Now, I didn't make a note for this, but I maybe it was in your book. Did you guys talk about how drivers can't see things or can't respond, and it's worse when they're on a phone, even if it's hands-free?
Yes. So one of the sort of false beliefs people have, aside from the belief that they will notice anything important that happens in front of them, which a lot of people believe in. We've done surveys on this. A lot of people believe that, and this experiment and others with the gorilla reveal that that's not true. But also people believe that the problem with using a phone while driving is that it takes your hands off of the wheel. But you don't need to think too long to realize that people can drive pretty well with one hand. And what requires a little bit, I think, more insight to figure out is that talking on the phone depletes a sort of a central pool of mental resources, mental energy, and that makes you worse at any other thing. So even though talking involves, sounds and language, and driving involves sight and looking and vision and so on, they still draw from a common pool of mental resources. And you may be able to drive okay on just an open road with no traffic and so on when talking on the phone, even hands-free. But once you get into any kind of situation that's difficult, that will demand attention, and especially unexpected objects, appearing, or unexpected people coming into your path, or cars or whatever, that demands attention to notice, and that is being depleted even by doing something that's not really visual, like talking on the phone.
Well, as I've gotten older and I've had more experience on the phone, I try to limit my conversations, and I don't even think about texting anymore, but only to open road, highway, straight. And a few weeks ago, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but it happens, I was talking to my wife about something that was taking apparently too much of my attention, and only at the last second did I realize there was a stop sign, and barely was able to stop. And I turned the corner and pulled over and parked and finished the conversation, because it makes a difference, and it can just be that little teeny thing. And one of the things you had talked about in the book was with this gorilla thing, that maybe it's because it's not real. It's a screen. It's two-dimensional. Maybe in person, this would not take effect. And you guys stepped it up and started doing experiments with people. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, all of our experiments are on people, of course. But what we did was we staged in the new set of experiments that you're talking about, which came out after the book. Actually, in a way, they were inspired by sharing the first chapter of the book with some of my students and discussing it. We realized that looking at a screen. Even a screen with an entertaining video of real people on it is not the same as being out in the three-dimensional world, moving around, with other people moving and so on. And we were sort of inspired to consider this also by the case of Kenny Conley, who was a Boston police officer who was prosecuted for obstruction of justice and perjury because he claimed to have not seen a beating that was happening very close to where he was chasing a suspect, and no one else, reported this beating or would say who was doing it or anything like that. So to make a long story short, Conley was there, and he admitted he was there, but he said he didn't see it, and so he was prosecuted on the theory that you can't be near something happening and not notice it. So we kind of set out to test that in similar conditions to the ones that Conley was in. So we actually had the participants in our experiments, the subjects, jog along a path through the Union College campus in New York. And at some point along the path, while the subjects were running and following someone else that we had, was working for us, that was part of the experiment, at some point along that path, unbeknownst to the subjects, we staged a fight. And we had two students pretend to beat up a third student. In the parking lot of a fraternity, incidentally, and at the end of the run, we asked people whether they noticed the fight, and no matter what the conditions were, daytime or nighttime, and so on, a substantial number of people didn't see three people fighting, even though it was actually visible to them for, from about 100 feet away up until they passed within about 20 or 25 feet of it, and. That I think is pretty dramatic evidence that even in these real-world situations, simple attention-demanding tasks like jogging or following someone can consume a significant amount of attention and make us not notice things that otherwise would be completely obvious.
It just reminded me, I've had situations where I've driven on a road hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, and then I find myself in a car where someone else is now driving for the first time on this road. And I'm not driving, I'm a passenger, and I'm looking out the window, and I'm surprised by how many things I see that I've never seen before. Because they weren't important, and just like when you're jogging, you have to focus on ahead and what's in front of you and following the person that you're following. And, we apparently only have a limit. And I know you guys also did experiments where you would change the person that someone was talking to right in front of them. Can you walk me through that a little bit?
Yeah, so what we've been talking about so far is a phenomenon called inattentional blindness, meaning that when you're not paying attention to something, it can be as though you're blind to it. You can't see it at all. So in the gorilla experiment, for example, it's not as though people don't notice the gorilla, but then when you tell them there was a gorilla there, they say, "Oh yeah, the gorilla. I just forgot to mention it to you." It's something they completely don't see. So the other phenomenon, which is similar but not the same, that you're talking about now, is called change blindness. So the idea here is that if you are looking at a visual scene or interacting with people, and something is changed when you're not paying attention, for example, changing one person into another person, you may well not notice it. So in the one of the experiments we did that we wrote about in the book, Dan Simons and I had Harvard students who were in the psychology building, in the lobby of the psychology building, go up to the 8th floor if they wanted to participate in an experiment. And when they got to the 8th floor, they could see a counter, and the counter said, "Experiment here." And they would walk up to the counter, and the person behind the counter would hand them a consent form to read and sign, indicating that they agree to be in an experiment. And then the person would take the consent form and duck down behind the counter, and a different person would pop up and hand them a sheet of paper and say, walk down the hall to room such and such for the study. And, unbeknownst to most of the subjects, that was the experiment right there, was the changing of the first person behind the counter into the second person. And once they got down to the room, they were just asked questions about what they noticed back at the counter and so on. And depending on how you do it, about 75% of people don't notice if you change one person into another. Now, it doesn't work so well if you try to change a man into a woman and things like that. But changing, sort of one man into another man seems to work pretty well, and many people often don't notice that. And that's been done in a variety of different settings as well. So the idea is that they're not looking when the person is changed, and when the second person comes back up, they don't compare that person to the first one and realize that they're talking to someone different unless maybe there's a mismatch on some very basic dimension like sex or age, like an older person versus a young person or something like that.
Well, I was just thinking of another test that I saw, and again, I don't think it's yours, but they would have someone sit down and they'd give them 8 photographs, and they would pick out the person who's the most beautiful, and then they would take all the photos away, and then they put back a photo that was never seen before, that like a 9th person, and say, now, tell me why you picked this person. And the subject would give all the reasons they picked that person, even though that wasn't the person just seconds ago they picked.
Yeah, that's a similar phenomenon called choice blindness. So the idea is that they made a choice, they picked one of the people, but they seem to be unaware of the details of their choice, such that if you tell them, okay, here's the person you chose, and it's not really the same person, they may not realize that you're showing them someone else. So this was Peter Johansson and Lars Hall and some other people demonstrated this, and I think it's obviously a related phenomenon. It seems to, what ties all these things together is they reveal some fairly large limitations on how much information we're processing at any one time and saving in memory and keeping track of. But more importantly, the contrast between the limited mental work we're doing or the limited mental work we can be aware of, the contrast between that and our beliefs about how much we are processing and how effective we are. So we believe we're going to notice unexpected things that happen right in front of us. We believe that we would notice if someone was replaced that we were having a conversation with, or we certainly believe that if we picked the most beautiful person, we would remember who we picked, 2 seconds later or something like that. So that's what kind of has made these kinds of psychology experiments interesting is that they contradict intuition so strongly.
And I know we could go on this, and we'll come back to some of this, but what I want to do is take a little different course here for a second and talk about your book also dipped into investing a little bit. And the thing that is most fascinating for me, you gave people, or I guess you didn't do this, you wrote about it, I'm sorry, about people getting information either really frequently or less frequently, and that they were able to use that to help them invest. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is an older study that was done by some economists. And I have to say that if we were to write the book over again or write a new edition or something like that, I might change this section a little bit because I think the situation is not as clear-cut as we presented when we described these experiments. But I think the point is worth pondering even if the results are not exactly as clean as we implied. And what happened was, in this experiment, a rough version of it is that people were, it was sort of a game. It was like an investing game where people had to make investing decisions, but not with real stocks or bonds or whatever. It was just sort of within the game, but they were paid off at the end according to how successful they were within the game. So they were sort of playing for real money, just not with real securities and real assets and so on. And they had a number of turns, and at each turn they found out that there had two funds they could invest in. So one fund had sort of high average return but high variance, which was meant to mimic sort of investing in stocks, and the other one had a low average return but low variance, kind of like investing in bonds. and they weren't told what the distribution of returns and so on was. They had to kind of figure that out over the course of the experiment.
Sure.
And so each turn they would get told how much their two funds went up and down the last turn, and then they would get to change their allocations, which is kind of a situation that mimics what happens to ordinary individual investors when they get their monthly or their quarterly statement, or they log in or whatever. They can see all that information and they can start making changes. And what was interesting about this experiment was that the people who made the most money in the experiment were the people who had the fewest turns and therefore got the least feedback about what had happened in the previous turn. And the reason why that is because the experiment was set up with something like, I'll make up a number which will be roughly like what they did. Let's say 60 periods. So if you imagine each period corresponds to a month, some subjects got feedback every month for 60 months and were allowed to change their allocations every month. Other subjects got feedback only, let's say, every quarter or every year. So if you only got feedback once a year, you only got 5 chances to change your allocation, which kind of seems bad. But on the other hand, if you only see what happens once a year, all the ups and downs of the stock fund will sort of even out over the year, and you will tend to see something which is like the long-run average return, which in this experiment, as in reality, has tended to be much higher for stocks than for bonds. So if you were in the short-term version where you saw it every month, stocks might be way down for a month, and then you might shift out of the stock fund and then miss out on the actual higher gains that you would have gotten if you had just stayed in for the rest of the time. So it was sort of like, one way of interpreting this is that too much information can be a bad thing, because what you're seeing is short-term information, which is largely noise, from a long-term point of view. From a long-term point of view, one could argue you never want to be out of stocks because they'll go up and down, but in the long run, you'll do great, so you shouldn't worry about those month-to-month, day-to-day, minute-to-minute, changes. But if you do get all that information constantly, it seems like it can lead you to come to bad conclusions and make bad decisions. So that was sort of the point of all that. Whether this really explains what actual investors do and why actual investors make mistakes, I think that's an open question. But it's at least a worthwhile thing to think about when you think about like how much information do you want, and how often should you be trading, and so on.
Well, I tell you, first thing is I appreciate the uncertainty that you're willing to acknowledge that it, just because you get this result doesn't mean that it's true and applies in the real world. The other thing is, I'm assuming you haven't listened to a whole lot of my podcasts before our interview.
No, in fact, I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't listen to any of them.
No, and that's fine, because I wanted the listeners to know that as much as I, as a human, love the fact that you agree with almost everything I tell my listeners, it wasn't because you listened to my show. And I tell people that the most often they should ever look at their portfolio is quarterly, and adjustments generally should be done once a year or two. And so this study and your understanding of it, while it may not really apply 100% in the real world, it, like you said, at least points to something that just having additional information doesn't necessarily make the additional information more valuable.
Yes, and information is, there are these sayings about the value of information, and when these sayings say that information is valuable and worth money and so on, they're not necessarily referring to all information. In retrospect, they're referring to information that was useful. Like, sort of, you can tell whether information was useful if it really makes money. But a lot of information is just not that useful, and it winds up being noise from a longer term point of view. So I think that's completely true, and we talk about this in the book in a section about what we call the illusion of knowledge. So the illusion of knowledge is sort of the belief that you understand something complicated much better than you actually do. And one thing that fosters the illusion of knowledge is access to a lot of information about something. And so the more information you can get about asset prices and news and so on, watching CNBC all day long or something like that, that fosters the belief that you actually understand what's going on in the market and what is, and what is going to and therefore what is going to happen in the future, and so on. And, there's as I mean, sure your listeners know, and you know better than I do, the academic literature on that, really strongly suggests that, it's not, I wouldn't say impossible, of course, but it's very difficult for any person just sampling the ordinary stream of information to make good moment-to-moment decisions about what to invest in.
It's really tough. And the research that you cited said that the really active traders ended up making 1/3 less in the long run, in part because of taxes and trading costs. But that's something I talk about all the time, the basic of buying and holding and keeping still. And listeners don't know this, but before we did the recording here, you had mentioned something about Madoff. Tell me about him. What do you know about his situation?
Well, the Madoff case was sort of breaking at the time we were finishing the book. We finished the book came out in May of 2010, I guess, and the whole Madoff thing came to a head. He was nothing was really public until he was arrested. End of 2008, I guess. And by the time our book came out, all the books about the Madoff case were coming out. So we didn't really have time to figure it all out and write about it in the book. But since then, I've read most of the books about Madoff and talked to a couple of people who were sort of peripherally involved in the case as well. And I think there are a couple of amazing things about the Madoff situation. One is, why did people invest with this guy? In hindsight, of course, it seems like an obvious scam. He was, the value of everyone's account was going up every single month. There was almost never a down month.
Yeah, it's a straight line.
And yeah, exactly. It was, in hindsight, one can easily say, well, that's ridiculous. Why did anybody believe that? But evidently, a lot of people believed it. Of course, some of them may have known what was going on and were taking advantage of him and so on. But a lot of individuals sort of had no idea, and small, and small organizations and so on, didn't really know. And one thing that comes out in the writing about this is Madoff was supremely self-possessed and confident when he talked to even his inquisitors.
Yeah.
People think, I think people don't realize sometimes that people think the SEC never investigated him, but in fact they investigated him many times.
Yes.
And they interviewed him, many times over the years, and different investigators interviewed him. And they, you can see this in some of the records, they had him bring out, boxes of papers, and so on. I'm sorry, you can see it in some of the movies that have been made about this. But he was incredibly, smooth and confident. I'm not a clinical psychologist, so who can say, whether he's a psychopath or a sociopath or what? But one thing that's obvious is he didn't betray any hints of doubt or lack of confidence. And one thing we write about in the book is that people pay a lot of attention to how confident other people are when deciding whether to believe them, when deciding whether to trust those people, whether to follow those people. There are some studies, suggesting things like, doctors who wear white coats are perceived as, as more legitimate, and doctors who look things up during clinical encounters with patients are perceived as less able to do their jobs because they have to look stuff up. And Madoff, he had it all right, he had it all right there in his head, and he answered every question, and people who, skeptical journalists who went to interview him came back not being skeptical anymore. And so he really exploited what we call the illusion of confidence, which is the belief that confident people are more competent, more accurate, more truthful, more trustworthy, and so on. So that's one part of it. But also, the other thing I think that's interesting about Madoff is that sometimes people did ask him to explain, what his trading secrets were. And I happen to have a quote here that it's not in our book, but I use it in talks that I've given since then. After all the SEC investigations failed to catch Madoff, the SEC went back and investigated its own investigations, and the Inspector General of the SEC went back and looked at all the investigations they had done and wrote a report about it. And I just would like to read like a lengthy quote from the SEC Inspector General's report, because it really sheds light on.
Can I make a guess of what they're going to say before you read it?
Oh yeah, sure. Let's play a game.
I don't know, but I'm going to guess that they are going to clear themselves, and that everything they looked at actually did pass muster.
Oh well, so this part of the quote that I'm going to read is not about. Well, it's partly about that, but it's more about what Madoff said that convinced. What Madoff said that the investigators heard, and how in hindsight it seems ridiculous, and unless you believe certain things about how human thinking works. So here's the quote. So David Kotz, who's the Inspector General of the SEC, said, in one of the examinations that the SEC conducted, they asked Madoff how he was able to achieve these returns. Madoff's returns were extraordinary and always consistent. He never had a down period, no matter how bad the market. And they asked him, how are you able to do this? Bernie Madoff said to them that he had a, quote, gut feel, unquote, of how to time the market. They asked him, what is the basis for this gut feel? And he said it was his observations of the trading room. He said he could actually sit on the trading room floor and feel the market and know exactly when to buy and exactly when to sell. And Madoff always bought at the right price and always sold at the right price day after day, year after year. Inexplicably, the SEC just accepted these answers and went on. So that's the end of the quote. The Inspector General of the SEC says, inexplicably, the SEC accepted Madoff's claim that he had a gut feel of how to time the market, and that was his secret. And I think there's sort of two interesting points here. One, why does the SEC believe that that's a legitimate way, that's it's possible to generate those returns through a gut feel? And two, why would anyone believe that? And I think part of the reason is that this is what we do talk about in sort of towards the end of the book, is that we do have this myth that human intuition, unconscious thought, feeling the market, observing people's behavior and so on, can yield profound insight and predict the future. This is why we pay money to psychics and all kinds of people like that. And Madoff, I think, sort of tapped into that and somehow was aware that people would believe in this kind of stuff. And so, he's essentially able to offer up this bullshit as though it's like an actual, an actual answer to what's your investing strategy. I feel the market. That's what. What else do you need to know? So, but the SEC believed it too. Like, okay, it's okay if some individual who doesn't know any better believes it, but the SEC really ought to not be accepting, those kinds of answers. And the Inspector General did conclude that inexplicably the SEC accepted these answers.
Well, he concludes that in hindsight now, knowing what happened. But did Madoff ever start to vary the returns, or he just had constant returns until it ended?
Well, they weren't constant. I think they did vary. I'm not quite sure why they varied. I do know that they reconstructed. They reconstructed trades after. They made up trades after the fact from actual data. So perhaps just sort of some variation in even when they picked all winning trades. Sometimes the winning trades make you 10.1%. Sometimes they make you 9.3% or whatever. So maybe it was just that. But there was variability. But this is an excellent point you bring up, because the variability was much smaller than it possibly could have been, right? And this is what Harry Markopolos, who was the so-called whistleblower, pointed out. He had sort of done mathematical analysis and simulation of this, and found that there was no strategy that could have reduced variability that much. It would have required trading, like more options than existed or something like that, in order to pinch the variability that much. And one thing one thing that fraudsters often trip up on is they make fake stuff that looks normal on the surface, but doesn't have the same qualities of randomness that real stuff has, right? So sort of scientific fraudsters, like people who make up data in scientific publications and so on, often, investigators have asked them for their data. And when they get the data, they find out that you can see that it's artificially generated because it doesn't have as much randomness in it as normal real world, data would be. It sort of fits the pattern much too well, and that's what Madoff's returns did. They sort of fit the pattern much too well. Another red flag, of course, which the SEC didn't seem to notice.
I've watched many documentaries on Madoff, so I can't keep them all straight anymore. But I remember the scene, at least in one of the shows, where this guy who was the whistleblower, who was examining all the data, came and gave a report to somebody, and they said, "What did you find?" And he says, "It's all made up." And they're like, "How can you know that?" And he goes, It's obvious. It's all made up. There's no way. And often the inspectors, when they were inspecting Madoff, they were looking for things like front running, where Madoff would know that he's going to sell in advance and he would buy and sell before everybody else. And so they'd look for that, and they didn't find it because it's not there, because it was just literally all made up.
It was a more outlandish scheme than people imagined that it could be. I think that's sort of part of it, right? Like if you do something so outrageous that no one could even imagine you doing it, it might be easier to get away with. And I think I think there's some evidence that some people who didn't believe the returns were based on real investments assumed it was front running.
Yeah.
And yet still went along with it, which is unethical. It's obviously unethical to invest with someone who you think is breaking the law in what they're doing with your money. But they were, but obviously they were wrong about what was actually going on. I think, Marco Polis, I don't know, I've never met him. I've only read about him and so on. I mean, I think obviously had, some very good intentions and did a lot of noble work, but he was not able to convince people of his ideas, I think, in part because it turns out to be hard to explain to people things like how much variability should you expect in a natural process. Like understanding randomness is just one of the things that humans seem to be really bad at. This is one reason why casinos, stay in business and make so much money, right? Is that understanding randomness is along with understanding what causes what, and what legitimate outcomes you can expect from what processes or inputs is something, that in this very complex world of financial instruments, and the economy and so on, our mind is just not well designed, to appreciate those kinds of things.
It's one of those things. I run into people all the time that are terrified of the volatility of the stock market, but they'll go to a casino. And so, it's just an amazing thing. The other thing that popped into my head, many years ago, we had a friend of the family who was a professional magician and had toured for like 20 years and then retired, had literally made his living as a traveling magician. And I told him that I had a card trick for him. And so I held up the cards, and, he picked a card and he remembered what it was. And then I sorted the cards and shuffled the cards, and he thought that I was pretending to not be able to even sort cards. I cannot sort a deck of cards. And so then I told him what card that he picked, and he could not figure out how I did it. And so he's like, did you hide it on the top? Did you just break it? Was it, is it this kind of trick? Is it that kind of trick? And he's going through all the possible ways one can do a card trick. And I guess there's like 20 or 30 of them, or I don't know, because he went through this long list. And then I eventually turned over the deck and showed him it was exactly 52 of the same card. And he was so incensed. He was so insulted because he would have never, ever, ever thought someone would do something that ridiculously, stupidly juvenile that it tricked him. And that's kind of like the Madoff thing. It was so blatantly obvious that no one could see it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great analogy, right? There's sort of the space of possibilities that we're willing to consider is, often a little bit more limited than it should be, especially when someone is trying to deceive you, right? We don't seem to factor in, other people's trying to seriously deceive us, and this can be, this can be a big problem whenever anyone is interpreting information, like when intelligence agencies like the CIA or something like that are interpreting information that they're getting from around the world. It's hard to factor in, what are the chances that someone is deliberately giving us this information to deceive us. It's just not something that comes naturally to most human beings. In fact, people who think that way all the time are called paranoid, and and then it's not adaptive, in normal human interaction to always be thinking that way. Yeah.
And I think. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, like mentioning the casino and so on. There is a difference between the casino and and the rest of the world in that the sources of variability in the casino are well defined, and they're specified, and the state regulates them essentially, and they regulate them in such a way that the casino makes a steady profit from the gaming. But you will not walk in and gamble on craps and suddenly like lose your whole house, right? Like your exposure is kind of limited, and the probabilities are known. I don't know how you feel about Nassim Taleb, but he has this concept in one of his books that he calls the ludic fallacy, which is sort of the belief that the randomness in the real world is like the randomness in games, like rolling dice or picking cards or something like that. That it's sort of well-defined randomness, and we know how much and how little, how big and how small the outcomes can be, and so on. So that is a difference between the casino and the real world. You invested with Madoff, you could have wound up, losing everything, which is, which is not what, not
it's
the
funny
same.
Because I think in some way, and I don't want to spend too much time on the casino thing, but if casinos were less regulated and people more frequently just completely lost all of their money by going in at one time, it would scare people off. But usually people who go broke gambling do it over months and years, and then other people think that they're better than average and say, okay, it happened to him or her, but it's not going to happen to me. And I'm just going to jump to another thing because we'll do this all day, I think, if I don't focus. You wrote a piece about how not to explain success, and I don't know if you remember that or...
I do.
You talked about that, and a study came out that said, how you can explain success. And do you remember what they said and what you disagreed with?
Well, so why some people we are definitely shifting topics, but I think it's a really interesting one because it's another example of where sort of our intuition about how the world works and sort of what we normally tend to believe might not be matched by might not match what's really going on that well. So there's a pair of authors named Amy Chua and Jed Rubenfeld, who are law professors at Yale, very, very smart, accomplished people. And they wrote a book together called The Triple Package, which in a nutshell says that there are sort of three key traits that distinguish successful people from less successful people. And in particular, they're talking not just about successful people, but they're talking about these traits as being characteristics of particular minority groups in the U.S. So I may not remember exactly what they are, but they basically had to do with self-control, meaning sort of like the willingness to sacrifice in the present for gains in the future, or even gains for future generations. Not your own. So self-control. An inferiority complex. Yep. Sort of, the sense that you're, that you're not good enough, combined with the idea that your ethnic group is special, or is somehow chosen or better than others, or something like that. So the appeal of their theory was that it was sort of like this counterintuitive idea that you needed to feel sort of inferior in some ways, superior in other ways, and and so on. And it's a little hard to even wrap your head around exactly how this is supposed to work, but their book is full of interesting anecdotes and and stories and so on. But what I did in this study with my colleague Josh Hart, who's a professor at Union College, is we decided to kind of test this out by surveying a lot of people, and we used recognized psychological tests for measuring things like self-esteem and ethnocentrism, which is sort of like the belief that your ethnic group is superior, and also self-control. But we also threw in some measurements of what the academic literature says are ingredients for success. So one of them is being intelligent. Yeah. People who are more intelligent tend to make more money on average. They tend to have higher status jobs, like in finance or law or business or something. Education, right? People who get more education, typically, have more career success. And your family background. So people who come from wealthy families or families with, with parents with high status occupations tend to also, do better. And it turns out that we basically found that all those traditional things are true. And we found no evidence that any kind of sense of inferiority or ethnic superiority or whatever, explained anything. So I think what the Chu and Rubenfeld book, did ultimately was it sort of provided an interesting, theory that appealed to intuition about, why do the Cubans seem to be doing better than, other immigrant groups, or why do people from Nigeria seem to be better in business than people from other parts of Africa, and so on. But in the end, there could well be, much different explanations from those. It could be that the people who immigrate are not, are not that representative of the places they come from. Also,
I'm going to give a lot of bias to that because I know, when America first was America, 400 or 500 years ago, the people that came over were obviously those who were willing to give up everything and throw themselves into a harsh environment, and they had to work really hard. Where maybe some of the people that stayed behind were doing okay and didn't need to take that risk. And the people we have from a lot of cultures that are coming today, they're the ones that are leaving their country behind and risking everything. So there's an inherent selection bias, at least potentially, that the people that come are the ones that want to achieve, that want to risk it all and try something new and different. But we could, again, that's another fun thing. Let's see, other things we'll talk on.
I think,
go ahead.
Well, just to finish up on this thing, I think the self-control part that they mentioned, does have value because from the academic literature, the personality trait called conscientiousness, which means exactly what you think it is, sort of, the tendency to get your work done and to do your duty and to be organized and to plan and so on. I mean, that is a predictor of success. And I suspect that the people who immigrate, to this country are probably, above average in that and also above average in intelligence and so on to start with. So like you say, it could be sort of an illusion that comes mostly from the fact that, we are attracting, the U.S. is attracting sort of, smart, organized, people from these other places.
Where does the ability to delay gratification fit in that? Is that part of the same category, do you think?
Yeah, I mean that's often grouped under the notion of self-control.
Yeah.
Basically, and sometimes the delay of gratification can be extreme, right? Where you basically work very hard so your children, can have something that you can't really. It's not necessarily saving for your own retirement; it's saving so that they can have, they can go to colleges, that whereas you may not have gone to college and so on, and that's. I'm not a sociologist or a historian, but that's a story you hear. That's certainly a story you hear a lot about.
That's another
families
fun
over the
thing.
Generations.
We're getting long, so I'm going to just shotgun a couple of ideas that are in the books because I really want my listeners to be teased into going and getting a copy because I think it was fantastic. So not only do I have the audiobook, but I have the hardcover, so I bought it twice. But we talked about we didn't talk about, but in the book you talk about flashbulb memories and the effect of an incredibly meaningful event and how that affects people, how people can't see what is there. We kind of touched on expected versus unexpected. You also talked about something my listeners are going to especially love, God on grilled cheese, and what was it? Mary on the Chicago. Oh, Our Lady of the Underpass in Chicago.
That's right. So I think that's a really relevant one for anyone interested in investing, right? So seeing patterns in randomness, the most entertaining way that comes up is when people see pictures of people or other real things in naturally occurring, objects, right? So the patterns of like the burnt cheese on the slices of pizza or the burns on a grilled cheese or, the salt stains that come down on concrete and so on can, you get enough grilled cheeses and enough pizzas and enough, concrete walls. Eventually, some of them are going to look like Jesus or the Virgin Mary or something like that. But what's of course interesting is that people don't always react that way. Like some people attach great significance to the fact that there happens to be a grilled cheese or a salt stain that looks like that. And that's an example of, seeing patterns in randomness and assuming that there's actually some kind of causal mechanism underneath them. Like this is someone or some force, somehow sending us a message, which to me is not that much different from looking retrospectively at patterns in stock market data or whatever price and volume data and so on, and taking meaning from them. You can do it in a more sophisticated way, which is to sort of look for patterns that correlate with things in the past. But then, of course, you have the problem of whether they're still going to do that in the future, whether you've sort of overfit, your model, right? And overfitting your model is essentially the same thing as seeing faces in burn marks. You've overfit your face, your model of faces to the point where it's not just seeing human faces, but it's seeing, seeing grilled cheeses and pizza slices and so on. And so that's not necessarily finding you true patterns and true causes, right? But this happens all the time in finance and other kinds of decision making.
The last thing I want to throw out for the listeners, of course, the book also talks about vaccines and how those work. The problem here that we talk about is we call it the illusion of cause, and the idea here is that people will often infer or conclude that one thing caused another when it merely when the one thing merely preceded the other one in time. So the classic example is when people started believing that having their children vaccinated for measles and other common diseases was causing autism. There's actually sort of no scientific evidence. There's not even a correlation between being vaccinated and developing autism, because if you look over hundreds of thousands of people, there are no more cases of autism in the people that were vaccinated than there are in the people that weren't vaccinated. But once that idea was out there, once there was a scientific article about it, then all of a sudden many people started realizing, started thinking, oh yes, my child who developed autism symptoms, did have a vaccine, like a few months earlier or something like that, or a few weeks earlier, or a few days earlier even. But given the fact that kids get lots of vaccines over the course of their childhood and so on, you can always find some event like a vaccination that preceded something like the development of upsetting, behavioral symptoms. And it's again a situation where, our minds have this nice ability to figure out what's causing what, but the present day environment we live in is sort of too complicated for that ability to operate optimally, right? We've got very complicated things going on and lots of events and so on. And when we link them together, we're not necessarily making, valid inferences. And this can lead to a lot of problems, right? When people don't get vaccinated, then you can have outbreaks and kids can die of formerly, basically eradicated diseases and so on. And that has happened. Well, we're going to end it there unless you come up with something else. I did want to mention the book title because I avoided that the whole time. It is called The Invisible Gorilla and Other Ways Our Intuitions Deceive Us, and it's by Christopher, and gosh, I moved my page. What is your middle initial?
F, but they can find me without knowing my middle initial.
Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons. And, of course, you have written other things, and one of the articles we were talking about was in the New York Times. So Google Christopher Chabris, and you'll find his stuff, and go get a copy of this book. Share it with your friends and family. And it's one of these things that a lot of the things that I talk about on the show, general skepticism, you hit on a whole bunch of these points, and it makes me a little weirded out to know, and it's probably a good thing, to know that so much of what I think I know, believe, see, and experience, I'm messing it up.
Well, yeah, I mean, go to theinvisiblegorilla.com also. You can see, more about the book and various links to videos and so on also there. And also follow me on Twitter at CF Chabris if you guys are on Twitter. I post my articles and so on there, and don't feel. I mean, I don't think people should feel too down about themselves because they discover that the mind is not a perfect computer or something like that. I think it's really, in a way, it's kind of empowering knowledge, because then you can realize what are the pitfalls of daily life and of investing and so on, and take some steps to avoid them. Like don't look at the stock, don't look at the stock market every minute. Exactly that.
Well, I appreciate your time very much, and I'm very delighted to have you on the Phil Ferguson Show. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
He loves you and he needs money. He always needs money. He's all powerful, all perfect, all knowing, and all wise. Somehow, just can't handle money. Religion takes in billions of dollars. They pay no taxes, and they always need a little more. Now, you talk about a good bullshit story. Holy shit.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
All right, everybody. We're getting near the end of the show. A couple housekeeping things, of course. One review on iTunes this week. Don E. Stevens says, great financial info, great atheist-themed interviews, best swearing. Well, thank you, Don E. Stevens. I greatly appreciate that. It's one of those things I do worry about. I tend to swear, but a lot of people like it, but some people don't. And it's always a tricky thing, and one has to be careful to not get confirmation bias because often the people that don't like it just disappear and don't listen to the show. So I keep that in mind, but it's nice to know that at least for some people, it's not a real big problem. So I appreciate that. Nothing on Stitcher this week, so if you listen via Stitcher, please feel free to go and find my show and leave a review. If you're aware of any other place that has regular reviews and I've been missing out, let me know. I also have more events that I'll be going to later in this year. I know that in late August, I think it's August 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st, something like that, I will be in South Carolina for the American Atheist Convention. And thankfully, Yahweh decided to put a solar eclipse on the same day as the American Atheist Convention ends on Monday, August 21st. So I expect to be there, and I'm optimistic that my wife will have availability in her schedule to go with me, and if she can, her and I will tag team drive from Chicagoland down to South Carolina. And part of the logic in that is that if there's cloudy weather in South Carolina, we might just bail a few hours early and drive back along the Eclipse Trail into Tennessee or Kentucky or even southern Illinois to see the full solar eclipse. I've never been actually in a full solar eclipse, so I'm very excited about that. A few weeks later, we have the FFRF, Freedom from Religion Foundation Conference in September. That's September 15th, Friday. I think it starts on Friday, September 15th, 16th, and 17th. That's in Madison, Wisconsin, downtown Madison, Wisconsin. A lot of big-name speakers, authors, and even some more famous people. The FFRF convention is a little more, not compared to American Atheist, but compared to Gateway, upscale and expensive. So Gateway is a lot of people who are volunteering their time, donating time, and working really hard, movers and shakers in the movement who don't get paid much and you should donate to. The FFRF convention has people like Paula Poundstone, people who have other careers, and then they just come and talk at a conference like that. So it's a very different group. It's a very different mix. It's a much more expensive conference, and I think the hotel was something close to $200 a night. But it's not going to be in everybody's budget, but that's middle of September. I will be there, looking very much forward to that. And I think my wife might accompany me on that. She actually wanted to go because not only is Paula Poundstone going to be there, but Steven Pinker. And she read one of his books early on and helped her see her way out of religion. So we're looking very forward to that. And I'm flipping through my calendar here to see what else we've got. Oh, Myth Information. We talked about that months ago. They've got this conference planned way out in advance. That starts on, I think it's only on September 30th. That is in Milwaukee. And of course, yes, I'm biased towards things in the Midwest because I can drive to them and keep my costs down. So I was just in St. Louis. I'm going to be in Madison, and then I'll be in Milwaukee. So if you're in the area, if you're in Chicago, and a lot of people complain that there's not conferences in Chicago. Well, they, of course, probably missed the AHA conference in Chicago proper. But Milwaukee and Madison are not far. And I know I've got a lot of Illinois and Chicago listeners because it's a big city. But if you're in the Chicagoland suburbs, check those out. And then a little bit later on in the year, in late October, which is my anniversary, is CSI conference in Las Vegas, and it's the closest thing to a replacement for the amazing meeting formerly put on by the James Randi Educational Foundation. And I've actually had a lot of clients, because I have a lot of clients in California who have asked me if I'm going because they want to say hi in person. And so I'm still thinking about that, but now the needle has tilted towards the likelihood that I'm going. And this is going to be a record-breaking year for my wife, because if I go at all, it's because she's going with me, and then we may spend a few days afterwards on our honeymoon and vacation somewhere in the west, southwest, or something. We've still throwing it around. We may, of course, end up not going, but I think it's now more likely than ever. And I'm not yet sure if there's anything later in the year that I'll be going to, but I'll keep you posted so you can stop in and say hello. And if nothing else, you can enjoy a fun conference on your own. So that's all I have for this week. So we'll wrap up and we'll talk to you later. And if you see me in person, please feel free to say hello. Until then, ciao.
Well, I wrote this song for the Christian youth. I want to teach kids the Christian truth. If you want to reach those kids on the street, then you got to do a rap to a hip-hop beat. So I gave my sermon an urban kick. My rhymes are fly, my beats are sick. My crew is big and it keeps getting bigger. That's 'cause Jesus Christ is my nigga. Woo! He's a life changer, miracle arranger, born to the virgin mom in a manger. Water to wine, he's a drink exchanger, and he died for your sins. I preach the word, that's my gig, and I rhyme better than Notorious Big. All the other MCs, I wish them well, but if you live in sin, you burn in hell. Now I'ma pass the mic to my lovely wife. She's a fly MC and the light of my life. So to bust the rhyme without further ado, take it away, Mary Sue.
Jesus Christ is my nigga. He's the son of the original G. And he was sent to earth to elucidate the way that we should be. What? Like if another MC says you're a freak, you're a lame butt rapper and your rhymes are weak. I don't get mad and I don't critique. I forgive him and turn the other cheek. I don't blaspheme and I don't brag. I don't cuss and my pants don't sag. I do exude a little Christian swag and I'm proud to be an American.
Jesus Christ is a nigga.
Let his light shine through ya.
Let his love pop a cap in your butt and say hallelujah. Jesus Christ is a nigga. He's a homie MC, JC, you see. He's an honest, caring, peace-loving nigga like me. If you do drugs and you think you're cool, you need to come to Sunday school. Put those drugs in a garbage can. Stand up tall, you're a Christian man. Word up. I'm freestyling.
Hit me.